Hey, you joined just as I went live. Okay,
Okay.
yeah, good timing there. Okay, welcome to another live stream with Rashio Christi at Texas A&M University. Today we're going to be doing a quick overview of Alvin Plantinga's Evolutionary Argument against Naturalism. Looks like Robert's in the chat, so Robert, you want to say hi?
Greetings, folks. Nice to meet you.
Okay, so we'll just go over it and then discuss it. And Robert, I actually left out a lot of the scientific data from this. So if yeah, I know. So if you ever want to just step in and make a comment, I actually did look for. I found a good book called The Evolution of Cognition, which was a great peer-reviewed thing, but unfortunately, it was like 500 pages long, and I didn't have it.
That's short. You should have all of it on the presentation.
Well, I only found it. I only found it 2 days ago, and I could only read it twice, and I didn't feel like that was enough to,
Yeah, it was pretty low energy, right?
Yeah. So yeah. All right. So we'll get into this. Okay. So the evolutionary argument against naturalism. At the start, my primary source for this is there's a great anthology which is called Naturalism Defeated, subtitle Essays on Plantinga's Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism. And it's edited by James Belby, I believe is his name. And it's a great book. It opens up with a short overview of the argument by Plantinga himself, followed by, I believe, 12 chapters of people replying and criticizing his argument. And then at the very end, there's a long reply to all of the issues written by Plantinga. So that's where I'll be drawing most of this information from. Okay, a little bit about the roadmap here. So I'm going to cover just the background, the actual history of the argument, then we'll do a discussion. And I have a few prepared objections and Plantinga's replies, but I don't think we'll be able to get to that just because I don't want to spend that much time on it. So the general idea behind this argument is that the evolutionary development of the human brain gives us some reason to doubt our own rationality. The phrase that Plantinga uses is the reliability of cognitive faculties to arrive at truth. And this is not really it's not that original of an idea. So C.S. Lewis in his chapter, I believe in chapter 3 and chapter 13 of the book Miracles, he covers something kind of like this in the general idea, saying that there's some tension there if you accept evolution and also believe that your cognitive faculties are reliable. And Richard Taylor also had a little bit more scholarly presentation in his book on metaphysics, kind of tilting at this idea. But it wasn't until 1993 when Alvin Plantinga first presented a more rigorous and formal treatment of this argument in his book Warrant and Proper Function. And since then, he's had, I believe, 3 reformulations of the argument. So the information that I'm doing is primarily from 2002, was his formulation for this anthology, Naturalism Defeated, and then he had another formulation in 2008. And the gist of the argument is the same. It's just a little bit of difference in the tension or in the details. And something that's interesting is that, to my knowledge, all 3 of these guys actually accept evolution. I don't think that any of them would reject it. I know for a fact C.S. Lewis certainly accepted evolution. So this will be important because sometimes you hear these concepts being discussed as an objection to the theory of evolution, but that's actually not what it is. So let's start off with a couple of quotes to kind of get the idea. These are the 2 key quotes that Plantinga uses in his formulations. This one's from Charles Darwin. And whenever he was writing to William Graham about Graham's book, The Creed of Science, he says, "Graham, have expressed my inward conviction, though far more vividly and clearly than I could have done, namely the conviction that the universe is not the result of chance. But then with me the horrid doubt always arises, whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? And you can look at this, the full letter, at the link that I have there in the bottom right corner. And so Darwin was essentially getting at what Plantinga is getting at here, that whenever we think about the process that brought about the minds of the lower animals, like the simians and the monkeys and things like that, we don't really consider those to be highly rational creatures, or we don't really trust their cognitive faculties to come to major conclusions, or at least reliable conclusions. And so then Darwin says, but if those processes which brought about those minds also brought about our minds, then it appears that there may be some kind of reason to doubt our own faculties. And Plantinga notes that Darwin here was talking primarily about the big picture idea. So he wasn't talking about since monkeys can't do math, we can't do math, or anything like that. He was talking more along the lines of whenever we infer things about the universe, particularly religiously, Darwin was concerned about that, saying that I don't know that we can make these grand types of conclusions about the universe. Another quote, this is from philosopher Patricia Churchland. The extended quote is really long, so I just abbreviated it here. You can actually read the full paper, Epistemology in the Age of Neuroscience, at her website down there, patriciachurchland.com. And she is talking in this paper about different ways of looking at belief-forming faculties in humans, particularly the way that we come to know things, and the way that we evaluate that scientifically. And so she has this section here. She has this extended section talking about the evolutionary point of view. And she says, quote, "From an evolutionary point of view, the principal function of nervous systems is to enable the organism to move appropriately. Boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that that organism may survive." And she goes on to say things like representations of the external world are useful insofar as they result in a behavior that meets one of these 4 F's. And then she concludes the section by saying truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. So the idea is that your nervous system is primarily oriented towards these 4 functions. It's not oriented towards getting truth. If it stumbles upon truth, so be it, but that's not what the main purpose is. So these are the quotes that Plantinga leads off with, and then he takes this general idea that our minds are not evolved to gather truth, but rather they're evolved to make sure that we survive, and he formalizes it into what has become called the EAAN, or the Evolutionary Argument against Naturalism. And there are going to be a lot of words and letters thrown around here, so here are a few definitions. So the first one is a defeater, and a defeater, Plantinga has a definition that is about a paragraph long. The simplest way to describe a defeater is it is a belief that entails the falsity of another belief that you have, or it's a belief that can undercut your justification for believing in something else. So one of the examples in the literature, I've always found this to be really funny, is if you're driving along a road and you see what appears to be a cow standing on the side of the road, you form the belief that there's a cow on the side of the road. But if you learn that there's a crazy man going around putting up life-sized fake cows on this side of the road, then that is a defeater for your original belief that you saw a cow. It doesn't necessarily mean you didn't see a cow, but it does undercut your justification for thinking that you saw a cow. That's what a defeater is. So the reliability of cognitive faculties, which I'm going to call R, this is the trustworthiness of human thinking to arrive at true beliefs. In other words, whenever you engage your rational faculties, if they are reliable, then with a proper input and proper attention to detail, you can trust that you're going to arrive at truth. Naturalism is the belief that the natural universe is all that exists. There's nothing like God. There is no God. There's nothing supernatural out there. Everything that we understand is purely natural. And then evolution here would be that the diversity of life is attributed to genetic mutation, well, natural selection acting on genetic mutation, and essentially change over time. So that could be a little bit more precise. But when we're talking about evolution here, we're talking about the big picture of it. So, are there any comments so far?
No. I am also at this, while I'm listening to this, I'm simultaneously looking for a paper I came across, I think like 3 years ago, on the notion of mathematics alone and how children at a young age, they develop a mathematical framework versus, say, the prior hominids, and how this actually plays right in line with what you're getting at with evolution and God's guidance in that.
Okay. Yeah. All right, cool. Okay.
No, so keep going. It's good.
Okay. All right. So then 2 important notes here, or 1 important note, I guess. I said at the beginning, this is not an argument against evolution. So sometimes I'm going to name names here. I've heard people from young Earth creationist organizations that will say that if we were evolved from monkeys or whatever, then we can't trust our brains and everything's up for grabs. But like I said, that is not what this argument is against. It is against the conjunction of naturalism and evolution. So it's the evolutionary argument against naturalism and not the naturalistic argument against evolution. You can get out, if the argument is successful, then you can get out of it by either denying N or denying E or denying both of them. But like I said, to my knowledge, all of the people that promote this argument, they all accept evolution, or at least they don't necessarily object to it. So it's very important to make that distinction. Okay, so here's the formal argument laid out. So the first step is that the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is very low. And that we've kind of discussed is the intuition behind the 4 Fs and all that kind of stuff. So second, if you believe naturalism and evolution are both true, but you also realize that the probability of your cognitive faculties being reliable are low, then you have a defeater for believing in your in reliable cognition. Now, normally that would be fairly non-controversial. You believe something, you realize that it's actually got a very low probability of being true. That is a defeater for that belief. But the unique thing is that a defeater for R is actually a universal defeater, because if you have reason to doubt that your own cognitive faculties are reliable, that means you have reason to doubt every single belief that you arrived at using your cognitive faculties. That basically means that pretty much every single thing that you believe is subject to doubt now. It's now subject to what's called an undercutting defeater. You've lost your basis of reasoning there. So since a defeater for R is so powerful, that makes this argument, that makes this argument very significant. So what that means ultimately is that N and E are themselves the makings of their own undoing. So they are, in fact, self-defeating. So if you're a naturalist and you accept evolution, you've, in fact, just denied naturalism and evolution. So that's kind of the gist of the argument there. So in order to address this, we have to discuss a little bit of what the relationship is to belief and behavior. So if we say that evolution is selecting for behaviors and not necessarily for beliefs, then we have to understand where these things are interacting. So there are 4, Plantinga gives 4 possible relationships between what you believe and how you behave. And the first one is called Epiphenomenalism. And essentially this just means that whatever you believe in your head has 0 bearing on the way that you behave. So it doesn't matter what you believe. All of your behavior is dictated by external forces or purely material things acting within you. Instinct, you could call it, or just stimulus response to the outside world. Whatever you believe and whatever you do just passes like ships in the night, no interaction whatsoever. So that's epiphenomenalism. The second one is called semantic epiphenomenalism, and this says that some of your beliefs actually do cause your behavior, but the reason that they cause behavior is not because of the actual content of what you believe, but it's really because of the physical content of that belief, the physical nature of it. So if you're a naturalist, then typically you would have to accept something to the effect of your beliefs being some sort of neurophysical phenomenon in your brain. Maybe a long-lasting, or a long, I can't remember what that's called, action potential, that's what I'm trying to say. Perhaps something like that, or a resulting current in your brain, or something to that effect. But the idea is that it's actually the material action of that belief in your brain that's causing your behavior, and not the meaning of it itself. So if I, for example, eat something because I think that it's good for me, the reason I eat it is not actually because of the content, this will be good for me, but it's actually because having the belief, this will be good for me, causes some sort of electrical synapse in my brain, which then results in certain behavior. So that's a little, that may be a little wonky, but the basic idea is that it doesn't matter what you believe, it's just that believing those things causes a chain reaction in your brain. So then the third one is that your beliefs do cause your behavior, and it's also because of the semantic content, but they're maladaptive. That means that the beliefs that you have result in bad behavior, which ultimately evolution selects against. And then the inverse of that is just that you have beliefs that are relevant to your behavior. They do have a causal relationship to your behavior, and they are evolutionarily adaptive, so that they encourage your survival. So the idea here is that with these four possibilities, the first three of them very obviously produce defeaters for your cognitive reliability. If it's really the case that whatever you believe does not affect your behavior, and it really is the case that evolution only selects for behavior, and thus your beliefs are totally invisible, then there really is no reason to think that any of your beliefs are rational, or that they are in fact reliably arrived at, or that they are even relevant to anything regarding your life. Semantic epiphenomenalism is a little bit more difficult, but the idea here is that if it's the case that what you believe, the actual content of your belief, doesn't matter, then you can actually have false beliefs, but if the electrical signal that it sends in your brain happens to be correct, and it happens to move you in the right direction, then that's all that matters, and evolution is just going to select for that. So you could actually be thinking and believing gibberish, but it just happens to be that the electrical current in your brain that supervenes on those beliefs also just happens to be useful for survival. And then obviously anything that's maladaptive will be selected against. So number 4 is really the only one that has much of a chance as far as perhaps salvaging the reliability of your cognitive faculties. And that is just the belief that, and that's the position that your beliefs are causative and they cause adaptive behaviors. So is there any comment on this one, on this section here?
No, keep going.
Okay. All right, cool. So if this argument is to be successful, then we need to look at what adaptive causal belief, we need to have some kind of argument against adaptive causal beliefs here. And the way that Plantinga argues is, he says you can't actually argue straight from a belief to a behavior. You also have to have a desire in there. And so he says that behavior is a result of a belief-desire pair. You believe something about how the world is, and you desire something, or you desire something in the world, and then with those two together, you then act to make your desires a reality. So the problem that Plantinga says is you can actually have a near infinite number of belief-desire pairs that ultimately result in the same action. And the belief that goes with that desire, in fact, doesn't have to be true. So the example that he gives is a prehistoric man named Paul running away from a tiger. So the desire here, or the adaptive behavior here is to run away from the tiger so that Paul doesn't get eaten, right? But Plantinga goes through a couple of ridiculous belief-desire pairs that result in the behavior of Paul running away from the dangerous tiger. So the first one is the true one, which is, I believe the tiger is dangerous. I do not want to be killed. Therefore, I run away. But suppose Paul believes that tigers are wonderful creatures. In fact, they are divine beings. They're members of the divine council that have come on earth. But the best way to worship them is to run and hide, because you cannot stand to be in the presence of their glory. Well, that's obviously a ridiculous belief, and that's also a really stupid desire. But if you believe that and you desire to worship the tiger, then you will run away from the tiger and also survive. Another one could be that maybe you happen to love tigers and you think that the best way to love a tiger is to run away, or any number of other things that can work here. So the idea that Plantinga is getting at is that even if beliefs are causative, and even if they cause adaptive behaviors, you also have to have a true belief with a rational desire. And that itself is, it sort of slips under the radar of the selective pressures of evolution. So this is a little graphic that one of the members of RC here at Texas A&M put together, and I thought it was pretty good. He says that if you look at this little filter over here, evolution is a filter that selects only cylindrical beliefs, if you will. And the cylindrical beliefs are the ones that are useful for survival, whereas the green ones are the true beliefs and the red ones are false beliefs. So he gives a couple of examples here. So a true belief that's also useful is that coral snakes are venomous. That's something that evolution would select for. But something that's also useful but false would be that you show love to tigers by running away from them. So you can actually see in this little graphic he has here that both of those are considered to be equally advantageous as far as evolution is concerned. And then you also have beliefs that are true but are not necessarily useful for survival. So one of them is heliocentric orbits. Humanity survived for thousands and thousands of years without ever knowing anything about the Copernican structure of the universe. In fact, one could even say that the entire animal kingdom survives without any such beliefs about the world at large, and yet evolution seems to say that they're perfectly happy with that. And then there's some beliefs that are not useful, and they're also false, like the moon being made out of blue cheese. The only thing, and I actually ribbed him for this, the way he set up this graphic here, it looks like evolution wants you to die if you think that the moon is made of blue cheese. But that's not something that really motivates behavior, unless maybe you say that I want to eat the moon, and then you go into space and try to eat it and then die, or something to that effect. But if you have a prehistoric man that's going into space to eat the moon, I think there are a lot of other factors to consider. But in any event, though, the point here is simply that evolution only cares if a belief is useful, and it doesn't seem to care so much if it's a true belief. So then we'll move into the wrapping up here. The implications of this argument, if it's in fact true, is that a defeater for R in reliability of cognitive faculties is a universal belief, meaning that any belief that you came to rationally is now undercut. There are some beliefs that maybe you know by immediate experience that can't be undercut by this, but in any event, the majority of our beliefs that most people care about, we used our rational faculties or cognitive faculties, and those beliefs are defeated. And it doesn't seem that a naturalist would have the explanatory resources from his philosophy, or I guess you could say in his metaphysical account of the world, to account for reliable cognitive faculties. All he has is purely material entities and random evolutionary processes. Doesn't seem like there's some other thing floating out there that would result in humans being endowed with reliable cognitive faculties. So while this is an internal critique, we can see that theists, particularly Christians, would be immune to an argument like this because we actually do have the explanatory resources to account for reliable cognitive faculties. Namely, we have the belief in God, and that God is, in some sense, the creator of the universe, and is, in some sense, has a vested interest in endowing his creatures with rational faculties. I believe Plantinga says that he draws kind of on Calvin's idea of the sensus divinitatis that all human beings have within them, essentially that human beings have the sense of God within them. And if God desires a meaningful relationship with human beings, it is necessary that he endow them with rational faculties. You could also say that as long as God desires us to know something about the universe, it would also require us to be endowed with rational faculties. Essentially, you could make an argument along the lines of saying that God has structured the universe in a beautiful way using the elegance of mathematics and things like that. And because of that, like that, he's also structured our minds to be useful for arriving at truth. So what that means is that evolution doesn't pose a threat to theists, but it does pose a threat to those that are not theist, or in this case, at least not naturalist. There's some atheists who may have explanatory resources. So that's the idea behind that argument. Now, whenever I posted on Facebook a poll in order to decide which topic we would do. The first choice was this argument, the evolutionary argument, and the second choice was the classic debate between Calvinism and Molinism and all that kind of stuff. So I can't resist but add a couple of extra comments here that are related to that topic. So, like I said, whenever we consider the theist does have the explanatory resources to account for the evolution of life directed by God, resulting in human creatures endowed with reliable cognitive faculties. But I think that we may need to go a step further and say that there are a few other attributes that this God would need to have in order to like that. And for the purpose of this discussion, it's important to have a proper definition of evolution. And something that I didn't make clear here is that I think that evolution entails truly stochastic events. That is, random events in the colloquial sense, as in they're non-determined. They are, the outcome of them is truly indeterminate. Things like quantum events, for example. Well, actually, that's up for debate. Bad example. But in any event, I would consider quantum events to be genuinely random and genuinely stochastic. So if you have this story about the origin of humanity and it involves genuinely stochastic events, genuinely random events, then you may need your God may need some additional attributes in order to account for that. So these are 5 counterfactuals that the God of evolution, as I call him, must know. So God must know, before he creates the universe, what spontaneous quantum phenomenon would indeterminately occur under any possible set of circumstances. And he must also know that for each quantum phenomenon, what macroevolutionary event, such as genetic mutation, that phenomenon would cause. And he would also have to know how each macroevolutionary event would affect the organism on which it operates, and how each evolutionary event would randomly cluster with other random evolutionary events, and how each of those clusters would ultimately affect the organisms on which it operates. And these things, these 5 statements, I got this from Kurt McGregor. This was a presentation that he gave at, I believe, ETS in 2008. And the title of his talk, The Impossibility of Evolution Apart from a God with Middle Knowledge, should tell you a little bit about where the answer is going with this. Essentially, these types of facts that need to be known are not the types of facts that can be known unless you have a God who has middle knowledge. In other words, a God who knows genuinely indeterministic counterfactuals in the form of if such and such circumstance were to obtain, then such and such effect would happen. McGregor goes through a couple of alternatives, which I've summarized here. If you take the Arminian route of simple foreknowledge, then God can know what mutations will occur, but he can't actually know what would occur under any other circumstance. And because of that, God is not actually in a position to direct evolution towards rational faculties or towards anything really. He just happens to know that that's what will happen in the universe. So I like to imagine this idea of God creating the universe, looking into the future, and then realizing that it just happened, that all of evolution just happened to converge on human beings with rational faculties, just happened to converge on the entire plan of salvation taking place. And God said, "Whew, I sure got lucky with that one." Now, if you're a Calvinist or a determinist, you could in fact account for some type of evolutionary occurrence, but you would have to deny the truly stochastic nature of evolution. And that's something that may be a little more controversial. It's not outside the realm of possibility, but it starts to really, that really commits you to a lot of views that may be a little heterodox, particularly when it comes to the events of quantum mechanics and things like that. So what this says is that you actually don't have any room in your doctrine of providence for a truly stochastic universe. Whereas someone who attributes middle knowledge to God, he actually has a God big enough to account for stochastic things and other events like that. And then open theism, if you say that God has no idea what the future is going to be and no idea what the future would have been, then you're really, there's just no hope at all for God doing this. So honestly, I find open theists, I find it really funny that there are open theists that are also very strongly correlating with theistic evolutionists. That is, if you are an open theist, there's a high probability you're a theistic evolutionist. But I think that's really funny because the providential accounting within open theism doesn't really allow for any type of reasonable understanding of evolution or any type of purposeful evolution. And so I would have to concur with McGregor that if you're a theistic evolutionist and you truly affirm the stochastic nature of evolution, and you also are an Orthodox Christian, then you're kind of left with Molinism as the only option in that point of view. So that's kind of the end of that. I have a couple of other prepared discussions taken from the book, but I think that now would be a good time to pitch it to open discussion.
I'm getting. In the side, I don't know if you want to screen share it, but I posted a link to a 2016 study from the Royal Society. The title is "Fossil Skulls Reveal that Blood Flow Rate to the Brain Increased Faster than Brain Volume During Human Evolution."
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually really interesting because there seems to be a proportional so the evolution of the skull size leading up to the Homo sapiens sapien, there seems to be a proportional rate in regards to the structure of a human, the structure of a hominid body, but then as humans come on the scene, most of the quote-unquote qualities of, in this case, strength and durability and so on, the blood flow and the oxygen and so on, actually is more directed towards the brain than, say, towards the muscles and so on. And so that's why chimps and gorillas, and they maintain a high durability physically, but mentally they're still lacking. And it's an interesting. So basically, the study was showing that evolution somehow knew that an increase in blood flow within this region is required for this particular species to then, appear and survive. Now the question is how, if you're speaking naturalistically, and not only that, but then it reaches an upper limit of how big the brain can actually be. And so the size of our brains is at that upper limit. Any bigger, and the brain will cook itself. So it's interesting that we've, it's kind of like we've reached the pinnacle of, in this case, brain size, that simultaneously matches an optimal blood flow level, and the brain size is big enough to account for all the things that the universe, how the universe runs. So our brain is sufficiently complex enough to, do tensor calculus, make up logical arguments, and so on. And so again, if evolution is a naturalistic process, how did it lead up to this level? You have the start of the universe, you have life starting 3.8 billion years ago, and it's directed towards a particular brain that arose a mere 50,000 years ago. And now we're doing, such complex mathematics that we can go to the moon.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I hope it's presenting, but I think this chart right here pretty much tells the whole story. Yeah, you've got cerebral blood flow here on the y-axis, or on the dependent axis, and then recency in history on the independent axis. Yeah, and it's showing a pretty strong correlation here. I didn't see in the results if they actually did a correlative study. That's probably just a fitting line, but I mean, it's pretty telling that it goes straight up to straight to Homo sapiens, increasing every generation. Right. I think this is interesting that Homo floresiensis and heidelbergensis are so much lower. It's almost like,
right,
even though they're considerably more recent. That's interesting. So I guess you could even say that, not only do you have those the philosophical issue of rationality, but you also have this odd, I guess you could say this odd phenomenon that we suddenly were being selected for out of nowhere for.
Yeah, and not just that, but spirituality. I mean, if spirituality is a kind of like a vestigial, because I've heard atheists say things like that, like, oh, spirituality is like a mental vestigial thing, that soon humans will evolve past the spiritual. Well, hang on a second. This so-called natural phenomena of how the brain then develops the way to where it is, then spirituality comes into play. And if there's no such thing as a quote-unquote spiritual experience of this notion of spirituality, and in this case obviously God and so on, then it shouldn't appear at all. It rather, you would think spirituality would be, if it's a primitive thing, you would think at least the Neanderthals would be quote-unquote spiritual, and then the Homo sapiens sapien evolve past that.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying spirituality is evolving?
No. Spirituality is a direct proportional result of the moment the human brain emerges, the introduction of spirituality into the universe happens. And the question is how or why? Why should that be?
When? Yeah, because that would be my question with your idea, because does that relate to like the Imago Dei?
Yeah. I'm obviously, and as Zachary has, here's a study showing a direct proportion of blood flow increase, nutrient increase, oxygen increase towards this developing brain that then reaches an upper limit size that it can't get any bigger than that, but it's still complex enough to account for pretty much everything in the universe, scientifically, meaning the brain is able to cognitively develop theorems and so on. And for the first time, this particular brain is a spiritual brain, like the brain starts to think spiritually. So the question is, if spirituality is a vestigial, part of evolution, it seems to be the case that the biggest and bestest brain in the universe, which would be the human brain, is now encompassing this thing called spirituality. But no other creature has that. So the question is why?
Mm-hmm. And so you're saying it's kind of guided by God, or is that what your argument is?
No. So this goes right in line with what Zachary was saying in his presentation, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah, the general idea is, if you are a naturalist, then evolution appears to pose a problem for your for believing that your cognitive faculties are reliable. But if you're a theist, then you can follow the evidence wherever it leads, and because you have, God in your, since you have God in your explanatory resources, it doesn't really pose a problem. So, what Robert's getting at there is that not only do you have this idea that, we have this interesting, I guess you could say, philosophical phenomenon that we appear to have rational brains. Not only that, but we also have the physical phenomenon that in history, evolution was oriented towards this goal of having a large brain, a large cranial capacity that would then support a high functioning, high energy brain. And with that brain, with the physical reality of having a brain like that, we were able to do abstract thought and advanced mathematics and things like that. Although I don't know that your example of going to the moon is a good example of advanced mathematics. That was all just Newtonian mechanics that 10th graders could do.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I thought you were going to say it never really happened.
Oh, well, I mean, that's a given, but still.
I'm using that as a layman, like a lay audience, only the audience, because the audience will think of that as the feat of humanity, so to speak. But obviously, in my opinion, the feat of humanity would be the Higgs boson find. That was pretty special.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. No, but that's the thing. The fact that humanity, and even then, I mean, the Higgs boson was done back in 2013, and a mere 4 years later, we're contemplating what a black hole visually looks like, and I think last time we discussed that from the movie Interstellar. It's just amazing.
Well, I think that movie got it right.
Every single day.
Like a sphere, right?
What?
I think that movie got it more right than most movies, didn't it?
Which one, Interstellar?
Yeah, that movie was the first to actually be peer-reviewed in regards to the simulations for the black holes.
Yeah.
So this high capacity of being creative every day, finding new things, even though we may think we reached the pinnacle. Just, again, and not only that, but let's say the last 2,000 years of church history, the way the wisdom of God is continually being manifested as the church grows, both in knowledge, theologically and scientifically. Again, there's like direct proportions, and why? If this is just a natural process, then in some sense we're wasting time, really, if it's just purely a natural process. Timothy Martin needs to be unhidden.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, Tim should be available.
Yay.
Also, Zach, that what's it called again? Something?
Epiphenomenalism?
Yeah, is that something to do with confirmation bias or something? Like, is there any relation to that, where sometimes you might wonder to yourself, hang on a second,
No,
I believe something, but is it really true?
It's actually, it's even weirder than that. So that was actually something we didn't get into. Or even though we do have generally reliable faculties, we still have systemic biases in the way that we think. No, epiphenomenalism simply says that your beliefs have no causal relevance to your actions. And the reason that you behave in a certain way has nothing to do with what you think about the world. It's only it's more or less just response to stimulus is what that is.
But I mean, don't you think if you think a certain action is moral, you'd be more likely to do it than?
You would think, but the idea. Okay, perhaps this is a better example. When people say love is just a chemical in your brain, that's kind of a description of epiphenomenalism. That the reason that you the reason that you pursue a woman, for example, you may think that you love her, but in reality, what you believe about her is nothing. It's all about the oxytocin and the serotonin and whatever other neurotransmitters are going on in your brain. That's what's actually making you behave in the way that you do. You may think it's because you have certain beliefs about who she is and things like that, but in fact, it's actually just the things in your brain. So it's really funny.
But is that
whenever? What?
I'm just wondering, is that? But that's just brain chemistry talk. So
yeah.
What about the metaphysical properties? So, are you arguing then that that's the only reason that it's just brain chemistry? There's nothing metaphysical about it.
Well, I don't believe that. I'm not an epiphenomenalist. In fact, very few people are.
Okay. I see.
Yeah. Here.
I think the argument would be that metaphysics doesn't exist under that view.
Yeah. Let me go back to let me screen share that slide again.
Hey, Robert, I sent you an article on Facebook. You should check Messenger.
Okay.
There we go. So if you look at it, what this is saying is Plantinga says that there are 4 ways of thinking about the way that your beliefs and your behavior interact with each other. So what you believe and the way that you behave, there's some type of interaction. And the first one, so epiphenomenalism is to say there's no interaction. It's just illusory. And then semantic epiphenomenalism says most of it's illusory, and then there are the other ones. But the idea is that epiphenomenalism says no causal reaction between beliefs and behavior. It's only chemical reactions, and it's only responses to stimuli. So what's really funny is whenever you see people that wear those T-shirts that say "love is a chemical" or something like that, from those people that they're usually worn by people that are supporters of science or ostensibly, science advocates. But the funny thing is that the belief love is just a chemical in your brain is a belief that is contradictory to epiphenomenalism, because presumably you arrived at that belief because you think that your behaviors and your beliefs actually do interact with each other. So it's funny.
So is it a form of determinism, kind of?
Yeah, it would be determinism, but it's even worse than that, because determinism, you can be a determinist and say that okay, so let's take Calvinists, for example. The common statement is that your desires, you act according to your desire, right? But this is saying what you think is a desire is actually it's only physical. Like whenever you say I desire to read a book, really you can actually take that statement. That's just a fancy way of describing the concentrations and the pH of your brain, essentially. The concentrations of different neurotransmitters, certain synapses firing, and that's it. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, that's what it would go down to. So. And so Plantinga says that this is the most egregious, because if epiphenomenalism is true, then evolution actually can't select for anything at all regarding your beliefs. Like there's nothing there. With semantic epiphenomenalism, evolution could select against certain maladaptive behavior, which may be attached to certain, physical events in your brain, but it doesn't actually select for anything related to beliefs. So. Well, any more comments or discussion points?
Nope, that's pretty much it.
All right, cool.
That was really interesting.
All right, cool. So again, the book I recommend is Naturalism Defeated, which is it really is it's a great read. It's only like 200 pages, but it's one of those really, really dense books, and I'd recommend that. Trying to think if there's anything else to do. Oh, right. If you check the video description, I'll post a link to both this book as well as the paper that Robert mentioned. Maybe a couple of other things if you're interested in this. I think I'm going to steal something from what Richard does in his Hangouts and give the last word to someone. So I think I'll give the last word to Joseph, since he's had no words.
All right, guys. Remember to check out thoughtsinthecar.blogspot.com, which is part of the broader Think Theism Network, which is, again, an affiliate of the Bible Thumping Wingnut.
All right. Thanks, guys.